Good morning, everyone. We'll just give it another minute or two just to allow a few final people to join the call, and then we'll get started. Good morning, and thank you for joining us for the Power On webinar this morning, focusing on kind of security and kind of where we believe that the focus area should be, both kind of through the end of this year and kind of into 2023. So joining me on this epic journey is our CTO, Steve Beaumont. Thank you very much for joining us today.
You're quite welcome. I'm looking forward to it.
Yep, and he has a wealth of knowledge and experience in kind of system center, modern management, the whole kind of Microsoft stack really, and has been doing it for a long time and is exceedingly good at it.
Far too many years that I want to count.
So just to kind of run through our agenda for today, we'll just kind of recap us to kind of where we believe the industry is and kind of where we are today, what our views are around kind of where things are going over the next kind of 18 months or so, kind of wrap that up at the end. And we're also going to have a question and answer session. So please do get your questions into the chat and we'll look at and respond to those.
Yeah, just on that one, absolutely. So we'll have a dedicated Q&A session at the end, so we'll go through and review some of them. However, as we're talking, if it spurs ideas around the different topic areas, please do drop them into the actual session as and when you're thinking about it. And there's every chance that we could either spur further discussions as we're talking or just answer them directly with some of the conversations that we're having. So anything that comes to mind around the security arenas of the different areas that you'll see, just get them into the Q&A panel as soon as possible. Lovely.
So kind of where are we today and how did we get here? Well, it's a long and sordid history, isn't it, really, around IT security? But I think that the key thing that up until recently, the user adoption hasn't been at the forefront of the security side of things. It's always been kind of user adoption or security. And I think that we're now just about on the cusp of making it security through user adoption, which I think is quite an exciting place to be and might hopefully allow us to not repeat some of the challenges and failures around the past kind of 20 years of IT. We've also got things like, well, security inevitably has also been kind of very expensive. Although we're again seeing with security still costs quite a lot of money when you compare it to having none. But also the benefits, I think, have certainly, unfortunately, due to things like ransomware and the increased what's the word? Delimitation, like the ease of attack nowadays has certainly shifted the cost benefit ratio more towards kind of investing in that area, and it's being seen as a key driver for a lot of businesses. As well as there's obviously a huge education gap for both kind of IT departments and for end users. and as well as the kind of inevitable change management side of things, is people are often harder to change than technology.
I think there's a couple of things on that side for me. So you're absolutely right. There's that whole end users just want to be able to get on and do stuff. So anything that you introduce at a technology layer that blocks them from productivity is difficult to swallow for both the end users and the business of understanding why productivity is taking a hit. That spend has always been just throughout IT generally, not just security. You always had to quantify, why are we doing this? What does it give back to the business? But with that whole expectations in the education side, and like you say, with that prevalence now of the ransomware side, is becoming a lot easier for businesses to understand the reputational impact more than anything. If they do get attacked, justifies that spend level as a mitigation against potential just big reputational damage with data leakage, etc.
So at Paron, we kind of break security down into kind of these 4 key areas, kind of covering the whole remote access side of things. So how do you get like in a kind of mobile and home working kind of based world, how do you get your users access to the right resources at the right time securely? You've got the identity piece, which is how do we prove that a user is who they say they are, that they have the authorization and the authentication to access those services, and how do we stop others from stealing that? There's obviously your more advanced features such as EDR, XDR, SIEM systems that kind of tie in and act as a kind of a further protection levels and that kind of defense in depth over and above those kind of remote access and identity layers. And then ultimately we actually see automation as a key pillar within the security space, either to free up time or to remove permissioning off of specific users and lock that stuff down further.
So with these being the main areas that we're going to be talking about today, so obviously we're going to dive into individual bits and discuss around them. So again, just for everyone on the call, if you have specific questions, queries, ideas like, oh, I'm trying to tackle this at the minute within the identity space, absolutely start to form some thought processes around what questions you have on that side.
Absolutely. But shall we get started with remote access, Steve?
Yes, a fairly contentious one from myself personally, but certainly something that's been around and had to be dealt with since almost the dawn of IT, with different requirements from just either especially prevalent now with staff having to work more remotely, and that's through even our choice or the fact that we've had that lovely thing with the pandemic that's kind of forced the hand on it. But it goes right back to all the different scenarios where we've had third parties, vendors that have to come into an environment. So it was never a case of you must be in an office to use IT. And now it's much more a collaborative side where we have to allow some form of remote access back into our environments. So I'm probably going to tee you up for this one. The most obvious one that most organizations go for is around, how do I establish a VPN?
Yeah. So that's still certainly the approach that most organizations are taking, especially once you're or when you're still kind of in a Active Directory, like domain joined environment, that kind of thing, where you need that low level access for system management access for both the configuration and kind of updating of the platform, as well as kind of talking to your domain controllers and things for that initial authentication piece, as well as obviously all of your line of business applications. We're certainly seeing movements away from that, and especially as you move to do things like Azure AD only devices, you can start to question, do I need a device tunnel? Do I need that device to actually have a connection back on premises, or is it just the access to the line of business apps that's needed?
So interesting point on that one. So I mentioned a minute ago, it's a bit of a contentious issue, especially for me personally, because I'm not a massive fan of VPNs. I understand that depending on where you are within your journey, there is a requirement for VPNs. But you mentioned something very specifically there between the difference between a device tunnel VPN and, well, I'm going to put the words in your mouth, user-based VPN.
Yeah.
What's the core fundamental difference on that? And then I have a follow-up question, if you don't mind, around how you can look at some of these security layers on top of that if you still need to use a VPN, which then we'll move on to reasons why I believe that you don't necessarily or should be looking at phasing them out.
Yeah, so obviously with a device tunnel or a device-based VPN, as soon as the computer is turned on, it will try and connect in. Similar to the way that if you were plugging your laptop into the local corporate LAN, it has access to the local network as soon as it's plugged in, and you're not reliant on a user to be on the device for you to have that domain level connectivity. And that's useful typically for that kind of initial authentication piece, as well as the device management configuration side of things. With a user-based VPN, that the tunnel comes up on a kind of a per user basis. So when the user logs into the device, either it automatically comes up, or they can then initiate a tunnel, and the connection is then provided purely for the lifetime of that user being logged in.
Okay, so from a pure easy analogy standpoint, my brain immediately screams that, hang on a second, if it's a device-based tunnel, then basically if that laptop gets stolen off a train and somebody flicks it on, connects to their Wi-Fi hotspot, they are now inside the environment, ignoring the fact that they haven't logged on, but that device is in essence, as soon as it sees a network connection, connected to the internal network, correct?
Yeah.
Yep. So putting aside some of the benefits of why you do that in terms of like the device management aspect that we can cover a different way, how much of a risk actually is that in your perception of that device being not with a corporate user logged onto it, connected into your network?
So, like anything, it depends on how it's actually configured. So, at Paron, we do a lot of kind of always-on VPN deployments, which provides us this kind of functionality. And one of the key elements that we do to kind of secure that device tunnel is by using the TPM chip, and it's a certificate-based authentication. And the certificate for that authentication, the private keys of that are stored in the TPM chip. So it's not like if someone did steal the device and it is kind of BitLockered and TPM'd, then it would find it extraordinarily hard to kind of take that certificate and provide that authentication to another device.
Right. So they're not just literally going to be able to get hold of that physical machine, either take a forensic image of the hard drive or rip the hard drive out, put it into somewhere else, and then connect to the environment because it's tied to that physical machine.
Exactly.
Which means even if it comes up, you're going to be sat at the login screen, and unless you can basically then bypass that off into the actual OS, you're not going to start running loads of commands and bits and pieces as that user.
Yeah.
So the weakest bit of that chain is, again, the identity credential for the user of that device.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's a different story when it comes to the security, and we'll talk around that side in a little bit, because if you know the user's username and password, fine, you can get in if you have their device. But with the way the world is now, it also means you probably get into half the other remote stuff anyway, because you know that user's identity.
And that's why we also specifically recommend using BitLocker with pins. So you have to have the separate pin to get into the logon prompt anyway.
Yeah.
Although that then has certain user experience and management issues associated with it.
Right. So actually putting the BitLocker pin in specifically, not talking about Windows Load for Business pin at the login screen, but you've got to go have a pin to get past the actual boot stage before you can even. So it's in effect a level of MFA, so multi-factor authentication.
Yeah, I mean
you have to know something to get somewhere. Yeah.
yeah, that's our recommendation. Whether businesses kind of you do go for that trade-off or not is a separate matter.
Absolutely. So obviously there is ways of making a more secure VPN connection if you still require a VPN side.
Yeah.
However, as I keep on kind of alluding to, there are ways to do a lot of this stuff now without VPNs.
Yeah.
So the obvious one on that one around the device management side, so not needing to have the device tunnel, would be to have a different way to manage the device. So that in its basic form consists of making sure that policies are delivered, Windows updates are delivered, applications are pushed down if they're required apps, and then potentially some remote assistance. Fair summary?
Yep, that's pretty much it.
So the main reason for having that device tunnel was so that you can basically traverse from your on-premises management tools into the device. So the easiest obvious focus for that one is to be able to shift to going rather than down or out your LAN WAN to the device to go across the internet back to the device. So as long as it has an internet IP, we can still manage it. So the main options around that one is either using something like Configuration Manager with its Cloud Management Gateway, so it's CMG. So if you're already invested in Config Manager, you can extend to do cloud management. And therefore, as long as the device has an IP address, you can do basically everything that you would normally do directly over the LAN or VPN, and or a cloud management system like Intune. So yes, I'm going to go straight to the Microsoft products because that's where I've got the most experience in, but there are other vendors and stuff that will do similar things. But the essence is look now, because we have so many of these devices out there on the internet, either trying to reduce your reliance on having that device tunnel up, move into something where we can just say, if it's on the internet, we can manage it securely. And obviously there's a raft of things that we do around that to make sure that it's not just a random internet connection across it. So device management is probably the easy, quick tick one, and a lot of people are already doing that, which removes a lot of the reliance on the device tunnel side. But probably the two biggest things that I see, and I'll ask for some of your opinions on this, Leo, is around the biggest other blockers, and this is why people have the VPNs, is on that user side, is people want to access both files that are on file shares. So traditional things like home drives, just general shared departmental work. And also the biggest one, they want to be able to print something.
Yeah. So
go on the files one. So what would be your initial go-to for organizations that have the traditional file servers that people want to access remotely?
Yeah, so for kind of traditional file servers, if you can get away with it, we're seeing a lot of success with the move to kind of OneDrive and SharePoint.
Yep.
The OneDrive client has come a long, long way since it first launched.
So,
and it is, yeah, we've been using it internally for many years to provide that kind of file share and cross and also document collaboration now as well, to a kind of without the need for direct connectivity between users and servers.
that's the thing for me. So there's the OneDrive for Business side, which is ideal for them scenarios where you're using it for users' home drives. They're the probably quickest and easiest thing to go and tackle, because it's a mapping of one-to-one. There's data there, the user needs access to it, shift it over there, redirect the OneDrive client so it's got the folder redirection and stuff to it, and you're basically done. I mean, I'm massively simplifying that. There's obviously other security thoughts that go around that in terms of then that data resides on the internet. It's not actually, but you get what I mean on that side. So how do we then go and secure again with the identity play, and how do we stop restrictions? And yes, there are some things to consider, so it's not just a complete open free-for-all. Now, the shared data sets, there's a couple of different approaches on that. There's the whole, fine, we can lift and shift everything to SharePoint, but that's a big project because you don't want to just try and replicate an unstructured file structure in SharePoint. That's about a bigger data and metadata awareness project. If I didn't want to go through all that entire things, there are some options, Leo, I believe, I say believe as if I don't know, around Azure Files. Now, for me, this is an interesting one because this does become much more of a, hang on a second, we're putting files and a file share directly accessible on the internet. So this is completely outside of the boundaries. What are the type of both changes that they have within that, and how do we even start to look at securing Azure Files?
Yes, so Azure Files has been around for quite a long time now, but there's been some very interesting improvements over the past kind of 6 months or so. You've got things like the ability to do Azure AD based authentication. And in fact, now you can even do domain-based authentication against Azure File servers. So that's the most common way of doing things like user profiles in Azure Virtual Desktop, is actually to, in quotes, domain join your storage account. And then you've also now got some interesting functionality, or you've then got Azure File Sync, which allows you to kind of synchronize your on-prem file servers up into Azure itself. And then there is also the upcoming Quick Support, so QUIC, which is a replacement or for kind of TCP for the SMB protocol, which is a lot of acronyms to basically say it's a much better way of accessing file servers over the internet because it uses port 443 rather than port 445, and which is often blocked.
That was the thing for me on the quick announcements. So like you say, the biggest thing for me is SMB. If you just tried to create an Azure file, you're saying to users, yep, you can map a normal drive like you used to, but 9 out of 10 places are going to block that whole 445 port, and you're not going to get to it, so it just falls down flat on its face. So fine, if we're moving that into the standard of 443, it's basically treated as web traffic. Does that still not then completely scare you to say, hang on a second, we just have a web URL to go to it? Does that mean now that anyone out there on the internet can access my files if I make the share available?
So there are still protections there around that. I mean, it's not as ideal as I think I'd like it, and I must admit I've not looked at it in huge amounts of detail. There are certainly other approaches, such as the Azure AD based authentication or the moving to things like SharePoint, if you can, but it really does depend if this is in terms of the cost benefit analysis, how important is that data to you?
Yeah, I mean, the shares still used because at the moment they're still sat on a Windows server, so it still has the whole NTFS permissionings and the shares in the background.
Yeah.
The main thing is then when you connect over the Quick protocol, it still passes the authentication, so it still takes the Kerberos token from your local machine or the identity, because depending on whether you're actually routing it through with a KDC proxy to get Kerberos authentication, otherwise it falls back to the NTLM v2. We're going into acronym world now, but it's basically you want Kerberos as a more secure mechanism. So it's still going to pass that identity across as part of the web traffic, so it still respects, even though it's just exposed to the internet, if you hit it and you don't have a matching identity to the permissions on that file share in your normal thing, it just makes sure that you cannot connect to it, and it'll just deny access. So it's kind of like being sat with a bring your own device inside the internal network, but you're outside the network, if that makes sense. So you still have to have an authorized device to be able to connect, and all this encrypted end to end. Do you want to just summarize some of the bits that we've just talked on the remote access, and then I'll probably move into the identity stage, which I'll also then probably pick up on the question that's just been asked around BitLocker pins with Autopilot.
Yep. So yeah, just in terms of the rest of the kind of remote access, things like CloudPrint are brilliant for being able to remove the need for printing kind of across your VPN. And then from a line of business application, I'm a big fan of Azure AD App Proxy for getting your web servers. And again, there's been a huge amount of functionality improved in that area, so that you can kind of do direct kind of single sign on to a lot of different types of application now in your environment, even through the Azure AD. And then finally, if you do still have those kind of thick apps that maybe you've got a couple that you can't just make SaaS or you can't put through App Proxy, you've got capabilities such as Windows 365 or Azure Virtual Desktop that you can use to provide that secure remote access front end to those kind of thick line of business apps if you do need them still.
Yeah, which is pretty much to the question that's just been asked in the thing around oversimplification. Yes, we're kind of going a little bit of pace at the minute. However, to your point on that one, as Leo just mentioned, there's the different layers. So yes, we've got the device management layer. Yes, we've got the Azure file, or not the Azure files, but how we access files and file systems. Then Leo mentioned there's the web application layer, so how we can use that with things like Azure AD App Proxy. There's the traditional style applications, so client server apps, where we can look at methods like either Citrix or Azure. My mind's gone blank. Help us out, not WVD, Azure Virtual Desktop, AVD.
Yeah.
AVD and Windows 365 and so on. So there's different layers that we can go across that can take away the need for the VPN. So yes, so going to that side, there are things that we can deliver for the legacy applications with AVD and Windows 365.
And again, this is all about that kind of journey as well. So you may still have a bunch of applications today, but looking forward at your kind of renewal cycles and replacement cycles for applications, are they potentially going to move more and more towards kind of SaaS-based or web app-based, which makes these options for alternatives significantly simpler? And say you've got 20 apps today that need thick clients, maybe going VPN-less doesn't make sense. Now, if you only had 2, for example, and you can kind of remote app those with AVD, it might change the conversation. So this webinar is all about kind of thinking, okay, well, what does my estate look like in 18 months? Are things like that going to happen? So can we start on that journey and start investigating those options around moving to a VPN-less approach? Would we want to, for example, and starting those initial thoughts and conversations with people?
Yeah. And which, to the other point on there around how we also protect some of those, leads us nicely into the next one around the identity side. So obviously you can make a lot of these much more accessible directly via the internet, etc., but we want to protect access to them. So be it logging into an AVD scenario or going and connecting to files or a web app with Azure AD App Proxy, they all rely on identity as that actual control plane. Now, there's a couple of different improvements with things like Windows Hello for Business now. So Windows Hello for Business starts to drive that whole conversation around moving, and this goes back to the BitLocker PIN question, around trying to introduce a level of passwordless. This has always been one of the main things when it comes to the identity plane, where at some point in time, and there's plenty of databases out there where you can go and look for leaked credentials, because people are humans, they want to be able to remember something easy that they can type in. So the password security layer kind of gets a little bit weakened, which then puts a little bit of a dink in your armor of moving to much more of an identity-based focus for your security for accessing applications. So Windows Hello for Business is not just about facial recognition. Let's make that really clear. This is the branding that they put around all the security mechanisms for biometrics, face recognition, PIN access, things like the actual keys that you plug in for YubiKeys and stuff like that, to name a brand, which I didn't mean to, but you get the idea. There's a different way of doing authentication without manually typing in a password. Now, going back to the BitLocker PIN one, So we mentioned about putting a pin at the beginning when trying to mitigate bringing up the device tunnel on a device. That has its drawbacks, but from user experience, and also if you're trying to implement that during autopilot is extremely difficult because you can't do policy settings to actually get a pin in place. However, as you start to move more to passwordless, it then does kind of remove that. It has a mitigating factor when it comes back to things like device tunnels on devices, because even if you get to the actual logon screen, there is no credential to really be leaked there, because not even the user knows the password in the first place if done differently. And we'll probably talk a little bit more on passwordless in its own essence, but just on that Windows Hello for Business side, some organizations have implemented it, some are still looking at how to do it. There have been some recent changes which does make it a lot easier to implement now. So one of the biggest changes now is, whereas before we had certificate-based trust or key-based trust, we now have a new model called Cloud Trust. Now this is in preview, but it simplifies the deployment because you don't have to do half the prerequisites around changing all of the different certificates on domain controllers and stuff, regenerating them and how you publish them out. And this is again driven by the whole passwordless movement that Microsoft are introducing, which now introduces Azure Active Directory's ability to deliver Kerberos tokens or partial Kerberos tokens. So there's a little bit to do on that side in terms of being able to configure it to say, yes, we actually now trust Azure AD to generate Kerberos tokens for our on-premises environment. But again, this is something that we can dive into probably much more deeper. We haven't got the time today, but this new Cloud Trust model, driven with the whole passwordless side and the Azure AD Kerberos, does bring in a lot more benefits and being able to how we represent the user identity that interops with on-premises authentication. So it's certainly something that is well worth looking into if you haven't already implemented it, or you can combine it with looking at a passwordless approach. Now, as I'm talking about passwordless, so Leo on that side of things, this all comes under some of the new cloud sync capabilities, how we generally interact with Azure AD. What else kind of brings into that score that helps with both our identity platform and the security controls that we can bring across it?
Yes, so there's been some real game-changing features released in the past 6 months, and specifically in the past month or so, with the ability to do proper group write-back, still in preview, but doing proper group write-back through Azure AD Connect. And the advantage of that is that whereas at the moment you might be kind of your source of authority is your on-prem, so you're building out your groups and things using AD users and computers and then synchronizing them up to Azure, you've never been able to really or in a supported way bring that synchronization back down. And for most organization, that has severely limited the capabilities of doing things like privileged identity management or access reviews, or even just being able to provide a wider ability for kind of business owners, for example, to manage their own groups and things, because you had to provide them either a custom tool or like Microsoft Identity Manager, which is a pain to set up, or some other kind of solution for group management. Whereas with Azure AD, they kind of built a lot of that stuff actually into some very easy to use interfaces, like web-based interfaces like the My Groups page and things like that. So you can now start really taking advantage of all these really cool cloud native kind of group management technologies that historically it was like we had kind of a main set of groups that we've had for decades on-prem, and then we had the small set of cloud only groups that we could only do limited things with, but had the really cool functionality. And now we can actually start to bring that really cool functionality kind of back on premises and take advantage of that. And there's some additional really cool stuff coming in that area where you can start to move more and more of your anchors to Azure AD, and then just use Active Directory as an endpoint rather than the anchor.
So when Azure AD first came out, it's kind of like, oh yeah, great, we're just taking the objects that we have on premise and they're in the cloud, and we didn't think much of it. What I tend to see that gets forgotten about is it's not just about your internal identities. Everything that you share through Office 365 with external people, every time you kind of invite people into groups within Teams and stuff, end up as objects within your Azure AD. There's tons, even within our environment, of external identities that have access to stuff over time that just general users are driving that. That is obviously a big security concern, because we have people that have access to stuff outside of our business. You mentioned access reviews. What does that do in terms of helping to ease my concerns around who actually needs to be within the environment?
Sure, yeah. So every external identity should have or is likely to have been added for a specific business reason, whether it's an associate working on behalf of us, or we're giving access to a customer so that they can access their own documents, things like that. And each of those external identities, in theory, has someone on the inside of the company that brought them in, requires them, knows about the life cycle of that user's access into our environment. So what we can do with access reviews is actually provide an automated way of going to those business owners and say, hey, do these people still need access? Have they logged in the past X number of days, months, years? And then provide that capability to either manually remove them or to automatically remove them based on the results of those access reviews. So we are delegating the access back out to the owners of the business requirements, rather than IT becoming the single point of authority for access into the system.
That's the thing for me. I'm a strong believer that it's not IT's role to be a gatekeeper in terms of who has access to what business data. If I can set up rules that says, fine, you asked them to be part of this project, you invited them to share this data, it is now your responsibility to say whether they still need to have continued access, but still set policy rules that says I can automatically yeet somebody out of the business, not an employee, but an external identity. Is like, right, if that person they invited doesn't respond within 4 weeks of the request, because everyone's busy, they might see it's not important, then fine, they just get cut off. It's up to that business owner then to start realize that they really do need to control who has access to the organization's data. Now, interestingly enough, and I'm just conscious of time as we're talking through bits and pieces, now, it's all very well and good that we're saying about having all this identity playing in and bringing other people in from external businesses and controlling how long they are within the environment, etc. But one of the things that's always been a bit of a pain is when you are collaborating with external organizations with your identity, and especially we see it all the time because we interact with lots and lots of different organizations, is I will have a conditional access prompt or an MFA prompt for one place to get into my bits within PowerOn, and then I'll go and hit a document, and then I'll get another one from a different organization, and then I'll go and hit another one, and it's just kind of a forever chain of getting re-authenticated. Now,
or the classic is for you want to work with another team on Teams or something. And
I just constantly switch identities all over the place.
Yeah.
Now, I said right at the beginning, identity is becoming a very much fundamental of your security playing, not trusting just having firewalls at the edge to say, can you come in or not? actually the identity and how we make sure that that is secured. And yes, strong passwords is one of them, removing passwords is a different way, but then actually looking at combining that with things like conditional access to say, right, who are you? Where are you coming in from? What are you trying to access? Where are you accessing it from in terms of, is this a personal device? Is this a corporate device that we have fully checked and are happy that it has things like BitLocker on it? So is the device compliant to our security standards? If we were accessing an external organization, or an external organization was accessing internally into us, we didn't used to have that capability as such to say, is your device secure? Are we happy that that thing that you're coming on is compliant because it doesn't belong to us? So we're just going to spam you with a million MFA prompts from our side of it. So Microsoft are introducing this new concept, which is called B2B Direct Connect, I believe.
Something along those lines, unless they've rebranded it again.
We'll wait an hour and they'll rebrand something. But what is this now trying to achieve when we've been talking about multiple prompts and not trusting or not knowing about what their device is like?
So it's ultimately about organizations being able to say that we trust the configuration of another tenant. So a good example of this is actually kind of Intune device compliance. So and this happens a lot in things like the NHS. So you've got like one NHS trust where they've got their devices all in, they've got device compliance in. That's all well and good, and so they're saying, okay, well, you can only access resources from a compliant device, which is all well and good until you've got someone from the council coming in who's doing, say, social services or something like that. They've got to work with these NHS systems. And again, the council's all up to speed. They've got their own Intune. They're all device compliance. But the council's devices are on a different tenant to the NHS ones. And therefore, the NHS tenant doesn't see the device as compliant for its standards. Now with the Direct Connect stuff we can do is we can actually put that link in and say, hey, we have various business relationships with this other tenant. We trust that when they say that their device is compliant, that we believe it's compliant to our standards as well. And that can obviously have its own legal and technical validations and things around that. But it means that when the device actually says, hey, I'm compliant and I'm compliant from this tenant, we're able to actually accept that as if they were compliant in the current tenant, and therefore give them access to the resources that they need.
Yeah, it's key. I'll just clarify that a bit. So it's not as if we're just saying, oh, we trust you as an organization that you say that your devices are compliant. What we're actually saying is, fine, we've discussed it with you. We're happy with what you class as a compliant device. So you've got rules in that says in Intune, this device must have BitLocker, must have secure password, must have X, Y, and Z. And not to divert slightly, with Intune, you can now do custom scripting to check for compliance items. So you can say, actually, I must make sure that this device has got a registry key set at this to make sure it's compliant. But in essence, we're saying we have worked with you. We're happy that your rules that mark a device are compliant, that we trust, so that when the device actually attempts to come in, it's properly queried at the Intune level to say, can you attest that this device is functionally secure? It will check, it will mark it as compliant with Intune and present that back to my organization to say, yep, according to all the policies in place and stuff, this device is secure. So we're not just trusting the organization that says, yeah, everything's fine. No, we trust that the controls you have in place are up to our standards, and then the device has to meet them to actually get into the environment.
Yeah.
Now, there is a side effect of this as well. So as you start to get down to this level where you're doing the whole, you can almost see it as that older style ADFS Federation side. So we're actually putting the stuff in place. So one of the benefits as they're bringing in the B2B Direct Connect is you'll actually also start to get within teams the ability to share channels into the other organization's tenant. So you don't have to then say, well, fine, I now need to switch and log in with a guest account to Teams, and then I can't be working in my home organization. So you'll start to see much more integration capabilities because we're trusting that flow between the organizations. Like I say, it's not just a pure, yep, we think we trust. It's like, no, we've verified what your procedures are. We're now looking at the actual controls being passed across as part of the authentication things to say, yes, the user's coming in from a secure location. Yes, the device is secure. Yes, they've already done MFA and so on. So as we go across that, obviously we're now starting to build up a load of stuff around the identity that can actually look at being our focus control for coming into resources. So it's all right saying, yep, we've now got a gateway mechanism before we let you get into resources. What else can we do though around some more of the advanced security sides that allows us to start to check that things are secure within our environment?
Yeah, so this is where things like the Microsoft Defender Suite really kind of kick in and kick it up a notch as well. And there's obviously competitors out there that do all of these things and more as well. But the real big thing, especially for small businesses, we've seen recently is that release of the Business Premium SKU and the bundling of a lot of the advanced security actually into this much cheaper kind of licensing package for those smaller organizations. I think it's going to do a really big uplift on those smaller organizations that are far more cost conscious to try and give them the tools they need to maintain their security in the in kind of this higher threat landscape.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I mean the business premium is for small organizations and we won't get much exposure personally within this because it's scoped up to 300 users. But that's not kind of the point on this bit, is it? It's the fact that Microsoft are very aware that security is a fundamental basis for everyone, and they took the big step of saying, here is our massive, great big enterprise product. They split it down licensing wise, so we've now got that whole P2, P1 and the business premium. But the business premium wasn't just about land grabbing for money at that point. It was about making the tool set a lot easier to bring in advanced security for smaller organizations that don't necessarily have the time or the resources or the skills to manage and maintain it. And this is the thing for me, you've got a lot of stuff within Defender, and I'm picking on Defender specifically at this point. Like you say, there are other tool sets out there. The main thing is around this idea that as you start to get into the advanced security remit and you're looking at different tool sets like the Darktraces, your Carbon Blacks, that are in essence going and gathering a ton of data from devices and trying to represent that in a way that you can take action on it. Defender is part of a lot of people's now purchases that they've already made. So the NHS have access to it just right across the board. If you're in things like M36 E3 and E5, it's part of them packages. So a lot of this tool set's already there that people either don't realize or haven't had a chance to go and look at. And it's about going and pulling out a lot of the data that is already in the machines, floating up to the cloud with Microsoft and stuff, and being able to leverage all of that analysis that Microsoft can do across it to then put that back in to both the proactive side as well as a lot around the threat hunting side. So some of them are missing off the business premium one because they're just way too advanced for what the organizations probably have time to look at. So it's much more focused on being able to just take some of that telemetry and tell you where there's either some vulnerabilities within the environment. This is similar to the P1 SKU. So doing a bit of vulnerability assessment to say where you need to go and close down loopholes, for want of a better word, just harden your environment a bit more. Whereas the P2 is much more about having teams that can go and interrogate your environment, dig into incidents, look across the board for indicators of compromise, and really start to secure your environment, both in a proactive as well as remediative action. Now, I can go and gather a lot of that information, and that is obviously just within one area of my environment. But what can I do with some of that information in terms of the alerts and stuff that are generated, Leo, that could potentially look at combining it into other data signals that I have within the environment?
Yeah, so this is where Microsoft Sentinel really has kind of been stepping up over the past year or so. So when it first launched, it was, should we say, very bare bones, and you really needed your own kind of security operations center to kind of take advantage of it fully.
So, sorry to interrupt. Microsoft Sentinel being, what is it?
So it is effectively a log aggregation cloud service with built-in analytics and rule sets.
So that typical type of SIEM system then, where we just bring everything into one central place, but with a lot of analytics on the actual top end of that data to make use of it.
Yeah, and then there's a lot of you can either customize it yourself, or you've got a lot of third parties are starting to work with Microsoft to build either connectors or their own sets of alert rules and dashboards and things off the top of it as well. So initially it was very good for kind of the Microsoft suite, but there was limited kind of connectors and functionality. I think I checked the other day and there's something like 140 connectors, something like that now. And that's not including the kind of the customized Logic App connectors that other providers do.
Okay. So one of my biggest problems with SIEMs has always been that it was usually just a tick in the box for compliance exercises to say, yes, I have something where I am dumping all of my log files. The biggest problem then is it was just literally a dumping ground.
Yeah.
You'd have a big collection of data that no one ever looked at, or they did occasionally if they had a compliancy audit or something coming up, and they'd say, oh yeah, we've reviewed the logs. Or you had to have a really dedicated, focused security operations center that would then go and look proactively at the data and knew what they was looking at. Is this just yet another dumping ground for it? I know you mentioned different integration packs, so it's great. We're sucking even more data in across it. What is the biggest difference between just a SIEM dumping ground, or where would it be useful for teams that are not dedicated, or even if they are dedicated, what sets it apart from just a different dumping ground?
Yeah, so ultimately, like any technology, you can put it in and completely ignore it. But the scale of the rule sets, that come with it, you don't need, like, the rules are mostly written in KQL, Microsoft's kind of cloud query language. So you can go and write your own rule sets, but a lot of organizations don't have either the time or the capability to do that. And kind of Microsoft recognize this. And so there's, I think, about 900 rules currently available, kind of spread across all of their connector packs. That you can, that they're all just in there. You can just select them and hit enable, and that as a baseline functionality is really good for a lot of organizations that don't necessarily have the dedicated skill set. Now, there is a level of maintenance and monitoring that you'll need to do. Obviously, you need to handle the alerts that come out of it, potentially tweak some of the rules depending on if they're overly shouty or erroneous. And then just to keep the rule set, or adding additional rules in as Microsoft makes them available, because they don't turn on by default.
Yeah. So it's one of those things. I mean, we're talking to probably the nth degree now in terms of the advanced security, because you're just getting all sorts of analytics, but it does a lot of that consolidation of the different data sources for you, which is great and has the contextual awareness. But that's not to say that we shouldn't focus on getting the basics right in the first place. So this is the thing, we've kind of gone right through a load of bits and pieces, and we're getting to this stage now where we're talking about the utopia vision. Everything that we kind of talk around is a building block platform, and this is about where your risks and your priorities lie, because it doesn't excuse you saying, yeah, we've got a monitoring tool and it's the best monitoring tool in the world, but we forgot to put a policy on a device, no matter where that device is, that actually stops the vulnerability in the first place. So there's got to be a big consideration that to get the basics right first. Are we using conditional access, multi-factor authentication? Or I'll call it out right away. Why have we not got multi-factor authentication as a default for all users right now? That should be a no-brainer step. Build it up then. So we're saying, fine, we've got some level of protection so we can't get easy credential leak. Or do we then look at the device policies? Are we actually applying BitLocker? Are we actually applying security policies? Have we got rid of local admins of all the devices? So going through and building up this chain has to be done. Otherwise, yes, your fancy tool sets at the end of it, they give you all the contextual awareness across the entire estate, will literally just be spent time hunting all the threat actors that have got into your environment because the basics weren't done right in the first place. So while we can talk around all the shiny tools, I really do want to stress that you still need to go through the basics, get them right and in place. Otherwise, yeah, you're just going to be constantly hunting everything that could have been avoided. Now, very conscious on time on this one. We've got the section on automation, which does build nicely because, as you mentioned, you can have the tools, and this could be the Defender side of it. It could be the Sentinel, etc. It could be your third-party products and stuff. But it's really good. And I'll probably hand back over to you on this side, Leo. Is looking at how you can actually start to take some of the mundane or some of the regular tasks and automate it.
Yeah, I mean, the classic here is, oh, my service desk need domain admins so that they can log on to servers, and it's like, well, why are they logging on to services? Oh, because they need to go and create user accounts in Active Directory, or they need to, I don't know, restart a service on the print server, that kind of thing. And it's like, well, actually, if you analyze that, you think of the amount of time that these people, not just the time that they're spending on doing these tasks, but the permission sets that you are giving, which opens up that the liability for each of these people. And the more people you have in these permit positions, the more risk there is of something going wrong. And if you can tie each of those things down and say, okay, well, the print servers need their service restarting. Well, if it's daily, then just create a scheduled task or something to have it done automatically. Or if it's an ad hoc thing, then there's some great automation platforms out there, whether that's Logic Apps or Azure Automation or any number of other automation platforms, so that and again, they all integrate with things like your service desk tools nowadays. ServiceNow is a brilliant one for that kind of thing. You can create these jobs that will automatically fire off and just go and do things. In fact, there's a really good case study, isn't there? Or case study as such, but even our own internal service desk, Steve, a couple of years ago, there was a lot of things being done manually, weren't there? Mm-hmm. And now, what, 60% of tickets are automatically handled, something like that?
Yep. Interesting enough, that so talking about security automation, there's a real big, well, not a big challenge, I say. It's sometimes not thought about that when you do just left shift and you start to create automation, a lot of people will just tend to then just go and create service accounts that go and run a lot of the automations. Now that in itself has a problem, because these service accounts will generally need higher level permissions to go and access the resources that they're interacting with. Are we just shifting the problem then at that point to say, well, actually now we need to protect that account really well, or is there something that we can actually replace the service accounts with, especially for cloud automation bits that would make that more secure?
Yeah, well, you've got things like Azure Arc that have come a long way recently, allow you to give identities to on-premises servers, and you can start to use either service principals or these kinds of computer accounts within Azure AD to provide that dedicated security and limitation. The other thing with even if it is just a dedicated user account, well, you can set it to 128 characters of password, and it's not going to complain at you when they try and log in. And you can also start doing a lot more detailed monitoring, because if that account is only doing this one thing, then you can set up the permissions so that they can only do that one thing, and B, you can also set up things like automation of, if it only runs at 3 o'clock in the morning, you could even set up a basic one of, if you're seeing logons any time other than 2:30 to 3:30, alert, because something else could have gone wrong.
Yeah, so basically, absolutely look at using automation to get rid of some of your manual tasks, interact with the security alerts to go and automatically quarantine bits and pieces, look where that can improve your speed to response and so on. But don't forget the security around your security automation or your general automation. Really conscious of time because we're running over. We do have the Q&A session next. However, unless anyone has got something that they can pop into the chat channel, what I'll probably do is follow up with some information to see whether there are some specific things that people want to take offline. So this is your last chance if you want to pop a question into the chat channel. Give people a second to rapidly start typing. Like I say, if not, you can feel free to reach out to us. Both myself and Leo are on Twitter, as well as being able to be contacted via the normal Poweron side. We actually got our addresses on there. We do. There we go. So feel free to hunt and stalk us on Twitter and send us anything that you might want to know on that side. Otherwise, you've got the general email address there, or you can probably work out what our actual email addresses are from first and surnames. Leo, so the other bits and pieces of useful resources, what can people actually do if they do want to have much more of an in-depth discussion? Because as you can probably tell for people on this webinar, me and Leo can talk for hours on this stuff.
Absolutely.
So
bore you all to sleep.
If somebody does want to listen to us for a much longer time period, what can they do?
Yeah, so they can reach out to us. We do offer some secure school workshops, so we can kind of understand your environment, give you some recommendations on kind of how do you take your kind of Active Directory and your AAD security to that next level. And then we've also got some free Protect, Detect, Respond workshops for webinar attendees, which kind of covers the whole ransomware scenario and how do you protect against it, detect it, and also how do you respond and recover from ransomware attacks. Or just drop us a line and we can certainly set up a more custom conversation depending on requirements.
Excellent. Well, I think with that, we've got no one that's still desperately typing, and if they are, we'll have to pick up on it later because I appreciate we're over time. I'd like to just thank everyone for joining, and probably Leo echo my thoughts on that.
Yep.
We'll leave it there.
Thank you very much.